the last species that appealed to humans. Now they no longer exist. The stars stretched endlessly before the horizon's edge as it drifted through unexplored space in the year 2247. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge with his arms crossed, watching the view screen display another unremarkable solar system. In his 15 years of service, he had seen dozens of alien species, most of them either hostile or indifferent to humanity. The galaxy had proven to be a cold and unforgiving place, and humans had learned to be just as cold in return. Dr. Lisa Hammond entered the bridge carrying her datapad, her eyes bright with excitement that Morrison had rarely seen in xenobiologists anymore. Most first contact scenarios ended in either violence or tedious diplomatic exchanges that led nowhere interesting. She approached Captain Henry Boyd, who sat in the command chair looking as stern as ever. The sensors had detected unusual readings from the third planet in this system, a world covered in purple and green forests that seemed to pulse with some kind of bioluminescent energy. Lieutenant Kyle Sanders worked at his station, analyzing the data streams that poured in from their long-range scans. The planet showed signs of civilization, but no spacefaring technology, no weapon systems, and no defensive satellites. Captain Boyd gave the order to enter orbit, and the ship descended through the atmosphere toward the largest concentration of life signs. What they saw on their screens made even the hardened military crew pause in wonder. Cities rose from the forest floor, but they were unlike anything humans had built. The structures seemed to grow from the trees themselves, spiraling upward in organic curves that glowed softly in the fading daylight. The landing party consisted of Morrison, Hammond, Sanders, and a security team of 6. They touched down in a clearing near one of the smaller settlements, and the moment the airlock opened, they heard it. Music drifted through the air, not mechanical or recorded, but living and present. The sounds were melodic and complex, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to speak directly to something deep in their chests. Then they saw the Vena for the first time. They emerged from the forest cautiously, moving with grace that reminded Morrison of dancers. They stood about 4 feet tall with slender builds and large eyes that reflected the light like pools of liquid silver. Their skin was pale and seemed to glow from within, shifting through subtle shades of blue and green. They wore simple clothing made from plant fibers, and they moved without fear toward the armed human soldiers. Hammond stepped forward slowly, her hand raised in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The nearest Vena tilted its head and its skin color shifted to a warm golden hue. Then something extraordinary happened. Morrison felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Not his own feelings, but something external. It was welcome, curiosity, and joy all blended together in a sensation he had never experienced before. The Vena could project their emotions, and humans could somehow perceive them. Communication proved easier than anyone had expected. The Vena did not speak in words at first, but their emotional projections combined with their musical sounds created a language that humans could understand on an instinctive level. Within hours, Hammond had established basic communication protocols, and the Vena assigned one of their number to serve as a liaison. Her name was Lyra, or at least that was the closest human approximation of the sound she made. She glowed more brightly than the others, and her presence radiated a warmth that made the entire landing party feel somehow safer and more at ease. She led them through the settlement, showing them the Vena way of life with obvious pride. The Vena had no weapons because they had never needed them. Their species had evolved without predators on their peaceful world, and they had never developed concepts like war or violence. They lived in harmony with their environment, growing their cities from living plants and harvesting only what they needed. Their culture centered around art, music, and emotional connection. Every Vena contributed to the collective beauty of their civilization. Morrison found himself drawn to Lyra in a way he had never been drawn to any alien before. She showed him their gardens where plants grew in impossible colors, their gathering halls where hundreds of Vena would come together to create symphonies of light and sound, and their libraries where knowledge was stored not in books, but in living crystals that resonated with emotional imprints. Over the following weeks, the human crew established a camp near the Vena settlement. Captain Boyd sent reports back to Earth Command, describing the species and their remarkable empathic abilities. Hammond worked tirelessly to document everything about Vena culture and biology, filling terabytes of data with her observations. Sanders conducted geological surveys of the planet and discovered something significant. The planet sat on enormous deposits of chromium, a rare element essential for faster-than-light travel. The deposits were larger than anything humanity had ever discovered, enough to fuel human expansion for centuries. Sanders reported this finding to Morrison privately, away from the Vena, and both men felt an uncomfortable twist in their stomachs. But for now, that information remained secondary to the wonder of first contact. The Vena welcomed the humans without reservation, treating them as honored guests and potential friends. They showed no concern about human technology or military capabilities. They simply accepted that other intelligent beings existed in the universe and wanted to learn from them. Lyra spent most of her time with Morrison, teaching him about Vena philosophy. She explained the concept of shared light, the belief that all conscious beings were connected through some fundamental force in the universe. She told him that the Vena had always known other species must exist among the stars, and they had hoped for this day when they would finally meet them. Morrison asked her if the Vena had ever fought among themselves, if they had ever experienced conflict or disagreement. Lyra's glow dimmed slightly, shifting to a confused blue. She projected feelings of bewilderment and sadness, struggling to understand the question itself. The concept of intentionally harming another conscious being was so foreign to her that she could not even properly imagine it. Back on Earth, news of the Vena spread rapidly through social media and news networks. For the first time in humanity's journey into space, people were not afraid of or disgusted by an alien species. The images of the small glowing beings with their large eyes and gentle demeanor triggered something protective and affectionate in human psychology. Children wanted Vena toys. Artists created paintings and sculptures inspired by Vena aesthetics. Musicians tried to recreate the haunting melodies that the Vena sang. Humanity fell in love with the Vena. The Galactic Coalition took notice of the discovery and sent an official delegation to evaluate the situation. The coalition was a loose alliance of spacefaring species that maintained certain standards for first contact and resource management. They had watched humanity's expansion with growing concern, viewing humans as aggressive newcomers who took what they wanted without regard for others. The delegation arrived 3 months after first contact, their ships descending from orbit with official fanfare. They were led by Counselor Zexthar, a reptilian being from a species that had already clashed with human interests twice before. His scales were dark green and his eyes were cold as he surveyed the Vena settlement and the human presence there. He called a meeting with Captain Boyd and delivered a stern warning. The Vena were under coalition protection as a developing species, and any exploitation of them or their world would result in severe consequences for humanity. Boyd assured him that human intentions were purely scientific and diplomatic, but Zexathar's expression suggested he believed none of it. Morrison watched this exchange from a distance and felt the first stirrings of unease. He looked at Lyra, who stood nearby with her glow dimmed to a worried purple, and he wondered what would happen when the rest of humanity learned about the chromium beneath this beautiful world. He wondered if the feelings of affection that billions of humans now felt for the Vena would be enough to protect them from what he knew his species was capable of doing. Lyra sensed his troubled emotions and moved closer, her glow shifting to a comforting green. She projected feelings of reassurance and trust, believing with absolute certainty that the humans who had shown her such friendship would never allow harm to come to her people. Morrison wanted desperately to believe she was right, but he had seen too much of humanity's history to share her faith. The chromium would not remain a secret for long, and when the corporations and politicians back on Earth learned about it, everything would change. He just hoped that the bond between humans and Vena would prove strong enough to withstand what was coming. But deep down, in a place he tried not to examine too closely, Morrison already knew the truth. Humanity always chose survival and profit over sentiment, always. The Vena had appealed to something good in humanity, something noble and compassionate. But history had shown time and again that those qualities vanished quickly when resources and power were at stake. He looked at Lyra's trusting face and felt something break inside his chest. She had no idea what was coming. None of the Vena did. They could not even conceive of the danger they were in, because they had never encountered a species like. The news reached Earth exactly as Morrison had feared it would. Within days of the chromium discovery becoming public knowledge, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Ambassador Claire Phillips found herself in the center of a diplomatic storm as various factions within the human government began positioning themselves to claim access to the resource that could fuel humanity's expansion for generations. She sat in her office reviewing the flood of messages from corporate representatives, military advisors, and politicians who all suddenly cared deeply about the Vena. The irony was not lost on her. 6 months ago, nobody in power had given much thought to the small glowing aliens that the public found so charming. Now every major corporation and government department wanted a piece of their world. Stellar Dynamics led the charge. Director Paul Grant, a silver-haired man whose fortune had been built on resource extraction across a dozen colony worlds, made his case directly to the United Earth Congress. He spoke eloquently about humanity's needs, about the colonies that were expanding faster than fuel supplies could support, about the economic opportunities that the chromium deposits represented. He promised jobs, prosperity, and security for billions of humans. He mentioned the Vena only in passing, as obstacles to be managed rather than people to be considered. Senator Kevin Brooks took up the cause with enthusiasm. He was a populist who understood how to channel public sentiment into political power, and he saw an opportunity in the Vena situation. During a heated congressional session, he delivered a speech that would be replayed millions of times across human space. He spoke about the hard realities of survival in a hostile galaxy, about humanity's responsibility to its own children and grandchildren, about the necessity of securing resources even when it meant making difficult choices. The speech resonated because it touched on genuine fears. Humanity was expanding rapidly, and resource scarcity was becoming a real concern. The chromium on the Vena world represented not just wealth, but survival for future generations of humans. Brooks painted a picture where sentiment and affection had to be balanced against practical needs. Back on the Vena homeworld, Morrison watched these developments through reports and video feeds with growing dread. Lyra noticed his increasingly troubled emotional state and asked him what was wrong. He tried to explain the concept of resource scarcity and economic pressure, but she struggled to understand. The Vena had always had enough, had always shared freely with each other. The idea that beings would harm others to take what they had was incomprehensible to her. Dr. Hammond made a discovery that added another layer of complexity to the situation. Through extensive study of Vena biology and behavior, she confirmed what many had suspected. The Vena were not just culturally pacifist, but biologically incapable of violence. Their nervous systems had evolved in an environment without predators or competition, and they literally lacked the neural pathways necessary to conceptualize or commit aggressive acts. They could not defend themselves even if they wanted to, because their brains could not process the necessary commands. She published her findings in a scientific journal, intending to demonstrate how unique and valuable the Vena were as a species worthy of protection. Instead, her research was seized upon by those who saw an opportunity. If the Vena could not fight back, then establishing mining operations would be simpler than anyone had anticipated. There would be no resistance, no conflict, no messy military engagements. The Galactic Coalition responded to humanity's obvious intentions with fury. Counselor Zexthar delivered a scathing address that was broadcast across Coalition space, condemning humanity as predators who destroyed everything they touched. He pointed to humanity's history of exploitation on Earth itself, the way they had driven countless species to extinction on their own world, before even reaching the stars. He argued that giving humans access to the Vena world would be signing a death warrant for an innocent species. Other Coalition members agreed, and proposals for sanctions against humanity began circulating. Some species threatened to close their borders to human ships. Others suggested military intervention if humans attempted to exploit the Vena. The diplomatic situation became increasingly tense, with humanity finding itself isolated and condemned by most of the galactic community. Ambassador Phillips worked frantically to find a middle ground. She knew that open conflict with the Coalition would be disastrous for humanity, but she also understood the economic and political pressures she was under. She needed a solution that would satisfy both the corporate interests, demanding access to the chromium, and the Coalition members demanding protection for the Vena. The compromise she proposed seemed reasonable on the surface. Humanity would establish a partnership with the Vena, providing them with advanced technology, medical assistance, and protection from potential threats. In exchange, the Vena would grant mining rights to designated areas far from their population centers. The operations would be carefully regulated and monitored to ensure minimal environmental impact. It would be a mutually beneficial arrangement between two civilizations. When Phillips presented the proposal to human leadership, it was approved enthusiastically. Senator Brooks praised it as an example of enlightened cooperation. Director Grant assured everyone that Stellar Dynamics would operate with the utmost care and respect for Vena culture. Even those who had initially opposed any exploitation of the Vena world found the partnership framework acceptable enough to support. Morrison was not convinced. He had read the fine print in the proposed contracts, had seen the loopholes and vague language that would allow mining operations to expand far beyond their stated limits. But he was only a commander with no political power, and his concerns were dismissed as overly cautious. The delegation that traveled to present the partnership offer to the Vena was led by Ambassador Phillips herself. Morrison and Hammond accompanied her, along with representatives from Stellar Dynamics and several politicians who wanted to be present for the historic moment. They gathered in the central meeting hall of the largest Vena settlement, a beautiful structure of living wood that glowed with soft bioluminescence. Lyra and the Council of Elders listened as Phillips explained the proposal through translators and emotional projection. The ambassador chose her words carefully, emphasizing the benefits and downplaying the mining operations. She spoke of friendship between species, of shared prosperity, of humanity's desire to help the Vena advance and grow. The Vena Council deliberated in their unique way, their bioluminescence shifting through complex patterns as they shared emotions and thoughts among themselves. Morrison watched Lyra's face and saw confusion there. Through her empathic abilities, she could sense the conflict within many of the humans present. She could feel Phillips's genuine hope that this would work, Hammond's deep worry and Morrison's barely suppressed dread. But she could also feel something else, something that disturbed her greatly. She sensed desperation in the human delegation, a fierce need that went beyond simple desire. She felt the weight of billions of human lives pressing down on this moment, demanding that resources be secured no matter the cost. She felt her people's world being valued not for itself but for what could be extracted from it. After what seemed like hours, the council reached their decision. The eldest among them, a Vena whose glow had faded to a pale silver with age, stepped forward. Through emotional projection and melodic sounds, he addressed the human delegation. His message was simple and devastating in its innocence. The Vena sensed humanity's desperation and pain. They felt the genuine concern for human children and future generations. They understood that humanity believed they needed what lay beneath the Vena world. And because the Vena philosophy centered on compassion and shared light, because they believed that all conscious beings were connected and should help each other, they agreed to the partnership. They agreed because they could not conceive of a species that would lie about their intentions. They agreed because their empathic abilities told them that many humans genuinely cared about the Vena and believed this arrangement would work. They agreed because saying no to beings in need went against everything they were. Ambassador Phillips thanked them with genuine relief in her voice. The politicians smiled and shook hands with Vena, who did not quite understand the gesture. Director Grant immediately began discussing logistics with his team, and Morrison stood to the side, watching Lyra's glow shift to an uncertain purple, and knew with absolute certainty that they had just sealed the Vena's fate. The contracts were signed within a week. Stellar Dynamics ships began arriving within a month. The initial mining sites were established in remote areas as promised, far from any Vena settlements. The operations began on what was described as a limited and carefully controlled scale. Representatives from both species posed for photographs that were distributed across human space, showing cooperation and friendship between civilizations. On Earth, the public breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Vena were safe, humanity had secured crucial resources, and everyone could feel good about the arrangement. The news cycles moved on to other stories. The cultural phenomenon around the Vena began to fade as people became absorbed in their 2 years passed like a slow bleed across the surface of the Vena homeworld. What had begun as limited mining operations in remote regions had metastasized into wholesale planetary exploitation. The initial projections for chromium extraction had been conservative, but once Stellar Dynamics engineers began their deep surveys, They discovered that the deposits ran far deeper and more extensively than anyone had imagined. The corporate appetite, already voracious, became insatiable. Director Paul Grant stood before the board of directors in a glass tower on Earth, presenting quarterly reports that showed profit margins exceeding even the most optimistic predictions. Stock prices soared. Shareholders celebrated. Jobs were created by the thousands. The economic boom that Senator Brooks had promised was materializing exactly as he said it would. Grant mentioned environmental concerns only briefly, assuring the board that all operations remained within legal parameters established by the partnership agreement. The partnership agreement had been modified 17 times in those 2 years. Each modification expanded the mining zones, loosened environmental restrictions, or redefined what constituted acceptable impact. The Vena Council of Elders approved each change because they did not understand the cumulative effect, because they still believed that humans would honor the spirit of their original agreement, because they had no concept of intentional deception. Dr. Nathan Wells arrived on the Vena world as an environmental scientist assigned to monitor ecological impact. He was young and idealistic, believing that his role was to protect the planet while allowing sustainable resource extraction. Within 3 months, his reports to Earth became increasingly desperate. The mining operations were causing catastrophic damage far beyond anything the partnership agreement had envisioned. The forest cities where the Vena lived were dying. The bioluminescent trees that formed the foundation of their civilization were withering as mining runoff contaminated the water table. Food sources that the Vena depended on were disappearing as whole ecosystems collapsed under the weight of industrial activity. Wells documented everything meticulously, filling his reports with data, photographs, and projections that showed an ecological disaster unfolding in real time. His reports were received on Earth, filed appropriately, and then quietly suppressed. Stellar Dynamics had representatives embedded in every level of the oversight bureaucracy, and they ensured that Wells's findings never reached anyone with the power or inclination to act on them. When Wells tried to go public with his data, he found his access to communication networks mysteriously restricted. When he persisted, he was recalled to Earth for mandatory consultation and never sent back. The Vena population began to decline in ways that confused human observers. They were not dying from violence or disease in the conventional sense. Instead, they were simply fading away. Their bioluminescence would dim gradually over weeks or months until it finally went dark, and they would be found in their homes or gardens, lifeless and cold. Medical examinations showed no obvious cause of death. Their bodies simply stopped functioning. Dr. Hammond, who had remained on the Vena world despite her growing horror at what was happening, finally understood what was killing them. The Vena were dying from empathic trauma. They felt the pain of their planet as if it were their own pain because, to them, there was no distinction. Every forest cleared, every river poisoned, every creature displaced by mining operations was a wound in their collective consciousness. They were biologically incapable of processing this level of suffering, so their bodies shut down rather than continue experiencing it. She published her findings in a desperate attempt to make humans understand what they were doing, but her research was met with skepticism and political spin. Corporate-funded scientists questioned her methodology. Politicians suggested she had gone native and lost her objectivity. The public, already uncomfortable with the growing reports from the Vena world, found it easier to doubt Hammond than to confront the implications of her research. The Vena population, which had numbered in the tens of millions during first contact, had fallen below 5 million. The decline was accelerating. Lyra, now recognized as a leader among her people despite never seeking such a role, made the decision to appeal directly to humanity's seat of power. She traveled to Earth aboard a human transport, accompanied by Hammond and a small delegation of Vena elders. The journey itself was traumatic for them, as leaving their homeworld caused a profound sense of disconnection and loss. But they believed that if humans could see them, could hear their plea in person, they would remember the compassion they had shown during first contact. The United Earth Congress granted Lyra an unprecedented opportunity to address them directly. The session was broadcast globally, and billions of humans tuned in to watch. When Lyra entered the Great Assembly Hall, the sight of her shocked those who remembered the bright, vibrant beings from the early footage. She was pale, her bioluminescence barely flickering, her movements slow and pained. She looked like a ghost of what she had been. She stood at the podium designed for human speakers, too tall for her diminished frame, and the chamber fell absolutely silent. Through translators and her weakened empathic projection, she spoke to the assembled representatives of humanity. Her voice was not accusatory or angry, because those emotions were still foreign to her nature. Instead, she simply asked humans to remember. She asked them to remember how they had felt during first contact, when they first heard Vena music and felt the warmth of empathic connection. She asked them to remember the joy they had expressed, the promises of friendship they had made, the tears some had shed at the beauty of two species meeting in peace. She asked them to remember that the Vena had trusted humans because they believed that feeling and caring were the same as protecting and preserving. She told them plainly that her people were dying, not from violence but from heartbreak. She explained how every Vena felt the suffering of their world, how they could sense the pain of every displaced creature and dying tree. She asked if humans, who had seemed capable of such empathy, could truly ignore this suffering once they understood it. She asked them to stop the mining, to honor the spirit of their first agreement, to let the Vena world heal. When she finished speaking, she collapsed at the podium, her strength finally exhausted. Medical personnel rushed to help her while the congressional chamber erupted in chaos. Some representatives wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. The footage of Lyra's speech spread across Earth and the colonies within minutes, and for a moment it seemed as though public opinion might shift powerfully enough to force governmental action. Protests erupted in major cities across Earth. Millions of people took to the streets demanding an end to the mining operations. The Vena had been beloved once, and for many humans that affection had never truly died. It had simply been buried under layers of rationalization and willful ignorance. Lyra's appearance brought it all back to the surface, forcing people to confront what was being done in their name. The Galactic Coalition, which had been threatening sanctions for months, formally offered to intervene. They proposed relocating the surviving Vena to a protected refuge world and establishing a military blockade around the Vena homeworld to prevent further human exploitation. Some coalition species volunteered ships and resources for the rescue operation. For the first time, humanity faced the real possibility of military conflict with the broader galactic community. Senator Brooks, recognizing the crisis, called for an emergency session of Congress. The vote that would determine the Vena's fate was scheduled for 1 week after Lyra's speech. The question was simple but profound. Would humanity abandon the mining operations and accept the economic consequences, or would it continue the extraction and accept the moral consequences? Morrison watched all of this from his small apartment on Earth, where he had tried and failed to rebuild his life after leaving the Vena world. He had resigned from military service and now worked as a civilian contractor, but the guilt followed him everywhere. When he saw Lyra on the broadcast, barely recognizable from the vibrant being he had known, something inside him finally broke free from paralysis. He began organizing a civilian response, contacting former crew members from the horizon's edge, reaching out to Hammond, gathering anyone who had actually spent time with the Vena and understood what was being lost. They formed a coalition of their own, dedicated to evacuating as many Vena as possible regardless of what the Congress decided. If humanity would not save them officially, then individual humans would try. The week before the vote was a storm of political maneuvering and public debate. Director Grant and Stellar Dynamics launched a massive media campaign, arguing that abandoning the mining operations would cause economic catastrophe. They produced economists who warned of job losses, energy crises, and the collapse of colonial expansion. They suggested that the Vena were dying because they were evolutionarily unfit for survival, not because of mining operations. Senator Brooks delivered another speech, this one more measured and somber than his first. He acknowledged the tragedy of the Vena situation, but argued that humanity could not sacrifice its own future for another species. He spoke about the billion. 6 months after the congressional vote, the Vena homeworld had transformed into something unrecognizable. The purple and green forests that had once covered vast continents were now reduced to scattered patches surrounded by mining operations. The rivers that had glowed with bioluminescent microorganisms ran gray and lifeless, choked with industrial waste that no amount of environmental oversight could contain. The cities that had grown from living trees stood empty and dark, their inhabitants either dead or dying. The Vena population had fallen below 1 million. The decline was no longer gradual but catastrophic, with thousands dying every week. Medical teams sent by the Galactic Coalition tried to help, but they quickly realized that the Vena were not dying from any treatable condition. They were dying from the simple fact that their world was being murdered, and they could feel every wound. Morrison's civilian evacuation effort managed to save approximately 800 Vena in those months, transporting them to Coalition refuge worlds against significant legal and political obstacles. Every ship that left carrying Vena refugees was technically in violation of human space law, and Morrison found himself branded a traitor by some and a hero by others. He did not care about either label. He only cared about the faces of the Vena he managed to save and the faces of the thousands he could not. Dr. Hammond worked alongside him, using her scientific credentials to document the evacuation as research rather than rescue. The distinction was thin enough to be almost meaningless, but it provided just enough legal cover to continue their work. She had aged visibly in the past 2 years, her hair now streaked with gray and her eyes carrying a weariness that no amount of rest could cure. The evacuated Vena were settled on 3 different Coalition worlds, each one carefully chosen for environmental compatibility. But even on these safe refuge worlds, the Vena struggled to survive. They were disconnected from their homeworld, from the vast empathic network that had sustained them for millennia. They existed but did not truly live, their bioluminescence dim and their songs silent. They grieved not just for their dead, but for their entire civilization. On the Vena homeworld itself, the situation descended into nightmare. Stellar Dynamics had discovered that the deepest chromium deposits were located directly beneath the largest remaining Vena population centers. Director Grant proposed a relocation program, promising to move the Vena to safe zones while the mining expanded. But the Vena could not be moved in any meaningful way. Their connection to specific locations, to the trees and land where their ancestors had lived, was so fundamental to their biology that forced relocation was effectively a death sentence. The company proceeded anyway. Engineers arrived with massive equipment and began clearing operations around populated areas. The Vena did not resist because they could not. They simply stayed in their homes as the machines approached, their bioluminescence flickering in patterns that expressed emotions humans had no words for. Some human workers quit rather than continue, unable to bear what they were doing. Others rationalized it as necessary work, as following orders, as doing their jobs. The machines kept moving forward. General Rita Hayes, who had assumed command of Earth's military operations in the sector, issued orders that no military personnel were to interfere with corporate operations, regardless of their personal feelings. She was a practical woman who believed in chain of command and the importance of resource security for humanity's future. When subordinates brought her reports of what was happening on the ground, she filed them appropriately and continued with her duties. Someone had to make the hard decisions, she told herself, and sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with strategic necessities. The Galactic Coalition imposed severe economic sanctions on humanity. Multiple species severed diplomatic relations entirely. Human ships were banned from certain regions of space. Trade agreements were canceled. Humanity found itself increasingly isolated in the galactic community, viewed with a mixture of fear and disgust by other civilized species. Counselor Zexthar delivered another speech, this one broadcast to every Coalition world, declaring that humanity had revealed its true nature and should be quarantined from the rest of the galaxy until it learned basic morality. On Earth, public opinion fractured along predictable lines. Those who had protested the mining operations became more vocal and more desperate, staging demonstrations that sometimes turned violent. They were met by counter-protesters who accused them of caring more about aliens than about human welfare, of being traitors who would condemn human children to poverty and scarcity for the sake of beings from another world. The debate became bitter and personal, tearing apart families and communities. Senator Brooks, now facing a difficult re-election campaign, tried to walk a middle line. He expressed sadness over the Vena situation, while maintaining that the Congress had made the only decision they could make. He commissioned studies on alternative energy sources that might reduce dependence on chromium, but the studies were underfunded and moved slowly. He made speeches about learning from this tragedy and doing better in the future, but his speeches rang hollow when set against the reality of what continued to happen on the Vena world. Morrison returned to the Vena homeworld one final time, traveling on a rescue ship that was making what everyone knew would be one of the last evacuation runs. What he found there broke something in him that would never heal. The world that had once been so beautiful, so full of light and music, was now a graveyard. Dead Vena lay in their homes, in their gardens, in their gathering halls. They had simply stopped living when they could no longer bear the pain of existence. He found Lyra in the settlement where they had first met. She was in the garden where they had walked during those early days of first contact, sitting beneath a tree that was slowly dying from root contamination. Her bioluminescence was barely visible, the faintest flicker of light that seemed to fade even as he watched. She was surrounded by other Vena, perhaps 20 in total, all in similar states of decline. Morrison approached slowly, and Lyra's dim light flickered in recognition. Through her weakened empathic projection, he felt what she was feeling, and it nearly drove him to his knees. She was in agony, not physical but spiritual, a pain so profound that his human mind could barely process it. She was feeling her entire species dying, feeling her world screaming in torment, feeling the weight of extinction pressing down on her consciousness. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. Morrison knelt beside her, taking her small hand in his, and listened as she used the last of her strength to tell him something she needed him to hear. She said that the Vena had known this might happen, that they had felt the danger in humanity from the beginning, but they had chosen to trust anyway because they believed that consciousness, any consciousness, could choose compassion over cruelty. They had believed that humans would choose to be better than their worst impulses. She said that the Vena did not hate humans for what they had done. Hatred was not something they were capable of feeling. They simply felt grief and confusion and a deep, overwhelming sadness that conscious beings could witness suffering and choose to perpetuate it anyway. She said that her people had tried to be a light for humanity, to show them a different way of existing in the universe. They had failed, but not because they had not tried hard enough. They had failed because some species cannot see light when darkness is more profitable. Her final words, translated through emotions more than sounds, were a statement that Morrison would carry with him forever. She said that the Vena forgave humanity, not because humans deserved forgiveness, but because forgiveness was the only response the Vena knew how to give. She said that she hoped humanity would learn from this, would become better, would ensure that no other species ever had to be a mirror for human conscience again. She said that the price of that education had been the extinction of her entire civilization, and she hoped that humans would consider whether the lesson had been worth the cost. Then her light went out completely, and she died in Morrison's arms. He sat there holding her body, as the other Vena around him followed her into death one by one, their lights extinguishing like stars at the end of the universe. When the last one died, Morrison carried Lyra's body to the evacuation ship, refusing to leave her behind in the wasteland her world had become. The final evacuation ships left the Vena homeworld carrying less than 500 survivors. Every other Vena had died, their civilization erased in less than 3 years of human contact. The planet continued to be mined, the operations expanding into areas where Vena cities had stood, erasing even the physical evidence that they had ever existed. The machines ground forward, extracting chromium from a tomb, and the humans operating them tried not to think about what their work meant. On Earth, the news of the Vena extinction was received with complex emotions. Memorial services were held in cities across the planet. Documentaries were produced examining what had happened and why. Philosophers and ethicists debated the implications for decades. The Vena became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a cultural touchstone that represented everything humanity could be ashamed of. But the chromium kept flowing. The economy continued to grow. 10 years passed like a sentence handed down by history itself. The Vena extinction became a fixed point in time that humanity could measure itself against. A before and after that divided generations. Children born after the extinction grew up learning about the small glowing beings that their species had destroyed, studying them in classrooms the way earlier generations had studied extinct Earth animals like passenger pigeons and dodo birds. The lesson was clear but uncomfortable. Humanity was capable of recognizing beauty and destroying it anyway. Director Jake Morrison ran the Vena Preservation Foundation from a modest office in Geneva. He was an old man now, his hair completely gray and his face marked by lines that spoke of years carrying weight that never grew lighter. The Foundation supported the surviving Vena scattered across 3 coalition refuge worlds, fewer than 800 individuals who represented the last living remnants of a civilization that had once numbered in the tens of millions. Every year that number grew smaller as the survivors died without being able to reproduce in meaningful numbers outside their destroyed homeworld's unique ecosystem. Dr. Lisa Hammond had compiled the most comprehensive archive of Vena culture that would ever exist. Her work filled entire libraries with documentation of their music, their art, their philosophy, and their biology. She had recorded everything she could before the extinction, knowing that future generations would need to understand what had been lost. Her archive became required study material for xenobiologists and cultural anthropologists across human space. It was also required reading and ethics courses, where professors used it to illustrate the consequences of moral failure. The mining operations on the Vena homeworld continued, though they were now fully automated. Very few humans worked there anymore, because those who did reported disturbing experiences. Workers claimed to hear singing in empty forests that no longer existed, to see glowing figures in their peripheral vision that vanished when looked at directly, to feel overwhelming sadness that had no obvious source. Some said the planet itself was haunted by the ghosts of the Vena. Others said it was just guilt manifesting as hallucination. Either way, the turnover rate for workers was so high that stellar dynamics eventually replaced almost everyone with machines. The Galactic Coalition's sanctions against humanity had eased somewhat over the decade, but they had never fully lifted. Humanity remained a pariah species, tolerated but not trusted, allowed to trade and travel but watched carefully for signs of similar behavior. The phrase, "Remember the Vena," had become a rallying cry among coalition species whenever humans proposed anything that might impact other civilizations. It was a warning and an accusation rolled into one simple statement. On Earth, the cultural memory of the Vena evolved in complex ways. Memorial services were held every year on the anniversary of first contact, with millions of people participating in moments of silence to honor the extinct species. Artists created paintings and sculptures of Vena, trying to capture the beauty that had been lost. Musicians composed pieces inspired by the recordings of Vena songs. The small glowing beings became symbols of innocence destroyed, of opportunities missed, of humanity's capacity for cruelty disguised as necessity. But there were also those who resented the Vena's memory. They argued that humanity had made a difficult choice in a difficult situation, that resources were necessary for survival, that sentiment could not be allowed to override practical needs. They pointed to the thriving colonies that the Chronium had made possible, to the millions of human lives that had been improved by access to abundant energy. They suggested that the Vena had been evolutionarily doomed anyway, too fragile for a harsh universe. These voices were quieter than they had been immediately after the extinction, but they never disappeared entirely. Adrian Cole was 23 years old and had never met a living Vena. He had been a child during the extinction, too young to understand what was happening in real time. But as he grew older and learned the full story, he became consumed by it in a way that concerned his family. He watched every piece of footage from first contact dozens of times. He read Hammond's entire archive. He traveled to Geneva to volunteer at Morrison's foundation. And eventually, he dedicated his entire life to supporting the few surviving Vena and preserving their memory. Morrison saw something of himself in the young man, a similar guilt and drive despite Adrian having no personal responsibility for what had happened. They worked together for 3 years before Morrison finally asked Adrian why he cared so much about a species he had never known. Adrian's answer was simple and devastating. He said that he needed to believe that humans could learn, that they could be better, that the Vena's extinction meant something beyond just another tragedy in a universe full of tragedies. He said that if humanity could not change after destroying something so beautiful, then being human meant nothing at all. The surviving Vena lived quiet lives on their refuge worlds, cared for by coalition caretakers and visited occasionally by humans like Morrison and Adrian. They no longer glowed as brightly as they once had. They rarely sang anymore. They existed in a state that was not quite living and not quite dying, shadows of what their species had been. They remembered their homeworld with an ache that never faded, feeling its absence like a phantom limb that could never be replaced. Keln was the eldest of the survivors, one of the few who had been an adult during first contact. He spent most of his time alone, sitting in gardens that coalition workers maintained in approximations of Vena aesthetics. When Adrian visited him, Keln spoke slowly and carefully, his empathic projection so weak that Adrian could barely feel it. He told Adrian things that history books and archives could not capture, memories of how his world had been before humans arrived, descriptions of the joy his people had felt when they first encountered another conscious species. He also told Adrian something that changed how the young man understood everything. Keln said that the Vena had known from the beginning that humans were dangerous. Their empathic senses had felt the predator beneath the compassion, had sensed the capacity for violence that humanity carried in its evolutionary heritage. But the Vena had chosen to trust anyway because they believed that consciousness itself was precious, that beings capable of feeling empathy could learn to choose it over cruelty. They had gambled their entire species on the hope that humans would choose to be better than their worst instincts. They had lost that gamble, but Keln did not regret that they had tried. He said that humanity was the most dangerous species the Vena had ever encountered, not because humans lacked empathy, but because they could feel it deeply and still choose to act against it when convenient. The Vena had not understood this fundamental aspect of human nature. They had believed that feeling and doing were inseparable, that anyone who could sense another's suffering would automatically work to end it. They had died because they could not comprehend a species that could witness pain and choose to perpetuate it for profit. Adrian asked Keln if he hated humans for what they had done. Keln's bioluminescence flickered with something too complex to translate easily. He said that hate was not something the Vena were capable of feeling even after everything. But he said that his people had learned something about the universe in their final years, a lesson that had come too late to save them. He said that consciousness was not enough to guarantee goodness, that intelligence was not the same as wisdom, and that empathy without action was just another form of cruelty. The moment that would define whether humanity had truly learned came in the 10th year after the Vena extinction. A deep space exploration vessel discovered another species on a distant world. The initial reports described them as peaceful, technologically primitive, and living on a planet rich with valuable resources. The similarities to the Vena situation were immediately apparent to everyone who read the reports. Senator Kevin Brooks, still in power after multiple re-election campaigns, called for an emergency session of Congress. He argued that humanity needed resources to continue expanding, that the galaxy was not kind to species that prioritized sentiment over survival, that difficult choices were sometimes necessary. But his voice no longer carried the weight it once had. Too many people remembered where that logic had led before. Morrison's Foundation launched a massive awareness campaign within hours of the discovery becoming public. Hammond published a detailed comparison between the new species and the Vena, highlighting every similarity and warning that history was about to repeat itself unless humanity made a different choice. Adrian organized protests across Earth and the colonies, and this time the protests were larger and more sustained than they had been for the Vena. Young people who had grown up with the weight of the Vena extinction refused to let it happen. Again, the corporations lined up with their economic projections and their promises of prosperity. The politicians debated, the public argued, and the galaxy watched to see what humanity would do when faced with the same choice a second time. The vote came after 3 months of fierce debate. In a decision that surprised many observers, the United Earth Congress voted to place the newly discovered species and their planet under strict protection. Resource extractii,